Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Carbon Brief's webinar brought to you live from Baku in Azerbaijan. Um, I'm Simon Evans. I'm the Deputy Editor and Senior Policy Editor at Carbon Brief. And I'm in Carbon Brief's office in the media zone at the COP venue. Um, we've got a team on the ground for both weeks, but some of our colleagues are joining us today remotely. Um, for these talks, I'm kind of coordinating all of our coverage, which will be culminating in our summary at the end of the talks. And I'm also particularly covering negotiations around what countries do this year to kind of recognise and carry forward the outcome from COP28 last year, which people might remember included this big global pledge for everyone to contribute to an effort at transitioning away from fossil fuels, amongst other things. I'm also covering the Article 6 carbon markets. And I'm now going to pass to my colleague Daisy, who's sitting next to me here.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yeah, my name's Daisy Dunn. I'm Carbon Brief's Associate Editor, and I'm coming from you from Baku as well. Um, I'm covering everything around the negotiations at COP29, including the role of Azerbaijan as the COP29 presidency and interventions that have been made by world leaders and new UN climate plans, which we've seen so far from the UAE, Brazil, and the UK. Yes, I'm happy to answer any questions about those areas. If you have any questions at any point during this webinar, please just put them in the Q&A box. So I'm passing over now to my colleague, Josh.
Hello, I'm Josh Gabatis. I am the policy correspondent at Carbon Brief, also here on the ground in Baku. I am covering primarily the negotiations around a new global goal for climate finance, which is the big flagship issue this year. And also I'm looking at the continuing negotiations around loss and damage. I will now pass to my colleague Wang Yuan.
Hello, I'm Wang Yuan. I'm the China section editor at Carbon Brief. I'm also in Baku at the moment. What I cover here is anything related to China. And now I'm passing it down to my colleague Aruna.
Hi, I'm Aruna Chandrasekhar. I cover food, land, and nature at Carbon Brief. I'm also tracking a couple of other subjects, such as response measures of how states respond to climate policies and climate change, and what are those implications. I'm also covering or helping Simon out on Article 6 and looking at carbon markets and their implications for food and land. So those are sections that I'm interested in, but I'm also a COP junkie. And looking at various issues, including finance, and paying close attention to everything. Yeah. I would like to pass on to Molly. Yeah.
Thanks, Verena. I'm Molly Lembria. I'm the section editor for policy at Carbon Brief, and I am covering the Global Goal and Adaptation, the Just Transition Work Programme, and the Mitigation Work Programme that got this year. Back to Simon, I think.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Daisy helped me out earlier. I should have mentioned we've already got loads of really good questions that we're going to dive into very shortly. But please do, if you have more questions, drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many as we can over the next kind of hour. So to kick us off in terms of the questions, I'm going to dive in straight away to the climate finance talks. This has been described as the finance COP, and we've got a question from Daniela, which I'm going to put to Josh, who's our kind of climate finance guru. Could you just give us a quick brief rundown of what's going on in the negotiations?
Yes, happy to. So just very briefly, climate finance is the term that's used in COP spaces to refer to the money traditionally flowing from developed countries, so in Western Europe, US, Japan, places like that, to developing countries. This is a kind of cornerstone of a lot of what happens at the COPs, because developing countries say that they need money to do pretty much everything to do with climate action, right? So to build clean energy or prepare for climate change or whatever. So here at this COP, there is a deadline to come up with a new climate finance target, which would be a global target to contribute a certain amount of climate finance. Could be to the developing countries, could be something a lot broader, perhaps a target that for all money everywhere in the world. So that's just a sort of taste of the kind of things that are being discussed. Basically, there is a large rift, I would say, very broadly speaking, in the negotiations between developed countries and developing countries. This isn't something new. This is often the kind of dynamics that are at play. They kind of disagree on pretty much everything to do with this new goal. Broadly speaking, developing countries would like a very large target in the trillions. So that would be trillions of dollars being provided, well, over $1 trillion being provided every year by developed countries, largely in the form of grants and other sort of non-concessional finance, so loans at good rates. They would like that to be the outcome. Unsurprisingly, developed countries don't want to sign up for that. They would like a much sort of broader goal that encompasses private investment and crucially money from other countries that aren't them, that are classified as developing countries in the UN process, but nevertheless are large or wealthy, and therefore they would say have the capacity to provide this finance. So China is the one people often speak about, but also countries like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and also lots of countries in Europe, which currently aren't obliged to, like places in Eastern Europe, for example. So that's the sort of big division. We knew that going into it. That's always been, you know, this is not a new issue. In these negotiations, there have been various sort of pre-negotiations before the COP that came up with a fairly short document, 9 pages long, which was presented at the start of the negotiations to the negotiators as a potential starting point for this 2-week process. What happened was, just to give you a brief summary, that document was pretty much immediately rejected by the G77 and China, which is a large group which encompasses all developing countries, I think, certainly over 130 developing countries. And they basically said that this isn't good enough. This doesn't reflect our positions. It's got too much emphasis on the needs, the demands of the developed countries. So we want you to go away and rewrite this text. Global North countries, developed countries, they also had problems with it. It wasn't just coming from the developing countries. They said, unsurprisingly, that it was unbalanced against them. So basically, the co-chairs who oversee these negotiations went away and they produced a new text, which was 34 pages long, which is completely unmanageable. You have to, this is a text which has to be negotiated and decided on. This text had all the options in it. So everything was on the table, back on the table after months and months of negotiations. So a lot of people were very unhappy about this. There's been sort of wrangling throughout the week. They managed to cut 1 page off to bring it down to 33. But essentially, we've ended week 1 in a worse position, you could say, than the one we started in. There's been a bit, people aren't very happy because the idea is that ideally you would sort of set the stage for next week when government ministers arrive to try and bring these negotiations home, and you'd ideally make it easier for them to do that. Currently, there's a lot on their plate, and they'll have to deal with some very political issues, such as, you know, how much money they can give to developing countries through aid and other means. Obviously, these are, you know, we're all familiar with like how controversial these things can be. So these are all going to play out over the next week or so. And yeah, we'll just have to buckle up and see what they can come up with. I to be honest, have absolutely no idea how they're going to bring it to a close, but I wish them best of luck.
Thanks, Josh. It's yeah, it's a pretty tricky state of affairs in the finance negotiations, as well as many other parts of the talks here. I think just to chime in briefly on the kind of where we're at in the COP, um, we're kind of it's quite typical at this stage of the COP towards the end of week one to be in this state where it's really not clear how an outcome's going to be possible. I'm just going to abuse my position as a moderator here to ask Aruna. I know you said you're a sort of self-confessed COP junkie. Do you think it's fair to say that there's always this kind of valley of despair moment, and they somehow kind of grab an outcome at the end out of out somewhere?
I think this particular lull is common. This valley of despair, nothing's happening. Everything has gone into informals. People are scattered. We are not seeing new texts. Things have gone into contact groups. Nobody knows what's happening. Way too many brackets. And then suddenly on a Thursday evening or a Thursday night, a bunch of texts drop, or it could be even a Friday night where they've managed to push through late nights. That's an environment that I thrive in as an nocturnal person. But that's generally the time where we see a lot actually happening. So I wouldn't say, I would say it's sit tight. I think also Carbon Brief's cavalry is coming in for week 2 to see how this pans out. But yeah, it should be interesting. And I think moving towards a big finish, I think there's a lot that's undecided, and there's a lot that can be decided very quickly. But these are also key texts which have ramifications for a really long period of time. So it's understandable if people are waiting for ministers, are waiting for signals, are buying time, the sort of delaying tactics that we might be seeing, because these are very tough calls, whether it's on finance, whether it's on markets, whether it's on adaptation that will last for a really long time. So I think the fighting over the nuances and buying time is, something that we see, but I think we might see a bit more of this year. So yeah, I don't know whether we're going to run a sweepstakes poll. Watch out for that, whether Carbon Brief decides to run it or when COP ends. But yeah, I think we're going to see an exciting finish.
Thanks, Aruna. I'm quite sure you're very much looking forward to that exciting and probably quite delayed finish. Daisy, if I can, I'd like to turn to you. We've got a question from Michael Davis about Azerbaijan's fossil fuel interests and the remarks made by the president about their fossil fuel resources being a gift from God. Michael's asking, do you think that that's likely to impede any real progress at the meeting?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of legitimate reporting into Azerbaijan's role of hosting COP29, given, its government revenue from oil and gas and its oil and gas interests. I think in terms of how it will affect the actual negotiations, I think it's worth bearing in mind the kind of role that presidents have at COPs. So, in a way, the presidency has a role in driving things forward and trying to corral consensus from parties. There are some key areas I think that we can look at to see where Azerbaijan is playing a role. So, for example, at the moment, parties are talking about finding a home for the language about transitioning away from fossil fuels, which was agreed in Dubai last year. And there's been some talk that this would appear in a cover text. So for kind of top of the first page of a book decision, I would describe it, of the key outcomes from this COP. And it's still not clear if there's going to be a cover text. That is something that the presidency has held consultations on yesterday, and they will play a role in that conversation. I think it's very interesting to keep watching and see what happens with that. But in terms of what's happened so far, I don't think we can say we've seen a massive political influence from Azerbaijan in the negotiations. But Simon, you might have something to add to that as well.
Yeah, I don't think I'd really add to that, but obviously, it's clear that, Azerbaijan's presidency in a press briefing earlier, they were saying this is a party-led process, as in it's not our responsibility. And, in a way, like that's very true. This is meant to be about nearly 200 countries. Of course, the presidency plays a big role in this process, and they will have to step up over the next few days if there's, if they're going to kind of wrangle an outcome from the current valley of despair moment. But it isn't just down to them, and I think people can maybe overstate the role of the presidency in how things turn out. Wan-Yuan, I'd like to turn to you. Obviously, particularly in light of what's happened in the US election, there's been an extra focus on China, and we've got a question, one of quite a few questions from. Oh, I'm not sure I'm going to try and pronounce this name. I'm really sorry. I'm just going to go straight to the question. So, what is China's stance on climate finance and adaptation at COP29? Particularly given its role as both, the world's biggest emitter, but also, the fact that it does give, money that can be thought of in terms of climate finance.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the question. I mean, China's overall stance on climate finance, I don't really think has changed a lot or changed at all, because it's basically saying that as a responsible and developing country, it has contributed as much as it can, and it wishes the developed countries to contribute more. As for this COP specifically, so China entered this COP under a lot of pressure, and it has over how much money it should be paid into the NCQG. And quite early on at one of the high level negotiations, China's vice premier said China has provided and mobilized the project funds of more than 177 billion yuan, which is roughly 24 billion US dollars for developing countries to combat climate change response. So those definitely sends the signal that China is doing more and is willing to, continue to do more on climate finance and contribute more. But according to some kind of interviews I did with officials and scholars, their general message they want to send out is the developed countries that with money should contribute a lot more than what China has already did. The figure 177 billion is roughly putting China the same position as a developed country, but China still views itself as a developing country and want more other people to contribute into the fund.
Thanks, Vanya. And I think that the amount that you mentioned, what was particularly interesting was the way that they talked about that money. So you mentioned that it was provided and mobilized, and it's basically UN speak for climate finance, and that's something that they hadn't done before. So it's perhaps a sign that there's conversations going on behind the scenes about how China can show, sort of hold out something of an olive branch in terms of it, maybe not explicitly being obliged to contribute climate finance, but nevertheless giving some voluntarily. Molly, I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask, you're following the mitigation work program, and that's obviously one of the places that might end up being the home for this global stocktake language about transitioning away from fossil fuels. Can you just tell us a bit about the different places that might end up being housed?
Yeah. So last year, when there was this great agreement and this sort of landmark language about fossil fuels in the final cover text, there was no real decision as to exactly where in the UN process that's going to sit going forward. So one of the suggestions so far has been the mitigation work program, because including it in a program covering mitigation makes a certain amount of logical sense, you'd think. But there's been quite a bit of pushback against that. So whether or not that will actually end up sitting within that is still very unsure. Effectively, there's concern from lots of developing countries that the NWP will just end up being a talk shop, which has been a scene that we've seen over the last few years as well, of people criticizing the fact that lots of developed countries would be quite happy to just use it as a sort of a space to share the best practice as opposed to actually implementing very much. So there's been this continued back and forth going on in the MWP over the last few days, and whether or not there will be enough of a push that we could get the fossil fuel language sitting within that and have some sort of practical, actionable things coming out of it going forwards remains to be seen next week, I think, really. Simon, I don't know if you want to add to that, because I know there's also the potential of it going into the cover text, right? If we have a cover text.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it's worth saying, like, alongside, this has been called the finance COP, but alongside finance, the other major battleground is this question about, the fossil fuel language, effectively something about climate, increasing ambition around, the action that countries around the world are taking to tackle climate change. We're likely to see record temperatures this year, in the first year averaging above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And it's very clear that, countries aren't on track to meet their collective climate goals. And so there's a big group of countries, from the EU and the US to the small island states and Latin American countries, that are very determined to see some kind of language in the outcome of this COP that refers to, ambition and refers back to that fossil fuel language from last year. If it isn't in the mitigation work program, the other place that it could be is as part of the stocktake. There was something called the UAE dialogue, which was specifically created to talk about implementing the outcomes of the global stocktake. But it was put in under a subsection of the stocktake with the heading of finance. And there's a big push from the like-minded group of developing countries, which includes China and India, among others, that the UAE dialogue should only talk about finance and nothing else. So it couldn't therefore talk about mitigation, couldn't talk about cutting emissions, couldn't talk about fossil fuels. If that option is ruled out, and if the mitigation work program option is ruled out, and given that there's that big group of countries that is very determined to see some of this fossil fuel language retained, then you kind of think, well, what are the other options? And that's why people are talking about a cover text. I mean, cover text didn't used to be a thing until a few years ago, and they've taken on this big sort of political status. I think particularly since COP26 in Glasgow, where there was the big fight about phasing out or phasing down unabated coal power. And so, that's certainly one option. But as Daisy mentioned, the presidency hasn't really revealed its hand on this. They haven't explicitly started talking about a cover text. So at this stage, we don't know if there's going to be one. I'm just gonna go on to another question. We've got some people who've been watching the news and seen these comments from the likes of Christiana Figueres, who of course was the UN climate chief during the Paris talks that resulted in the Paris Agreement. And they've come out saying that the COP process is not fit for purpose. Obviously, I already mentioned the 1.5 target and countries being off track. So they're saying that the COP process is not fit for purpose. And so the question is, why is anyone continuing with this format? Aruna, I don't know if you want to have a stab at that.
Always have strong feelings on the subject. I think it's the one forum where nations come together, irrespective, to be able to have a place to discuss these issues. You also have civil society and observers coming in there. It also helps you see where the tide is moving towards, both in terms of, mitigation and adaptation, than places where otherwise you would not have a forum to discuss these issues. Of course, these are never always, in terms of the outcomes that you expect, against the reality that you're looking at, is always going to seem a bit harsh. But I think it's vital. It's vital because there is no other sort of forum like this, which is also connecting to various other issues under the various other Rio conventions. So I mean, one of those things of, should we have a COP? I think it's quite essential to have a space where countries get, an equal say, an equal vote, and be able to bring their national circumstances, and, again, whether it's the biggest emitters or the biggest finance laggards are also sitting across the table from countries that are facing impacts every day and have to sit down across a table and discuss these issues. And also to be able to set up frameworks for everything that's happening, which has in the rest of the world, whether it's like setting rules for carbon markets, which will be reflected or will set the standard for everywhere else. So, what actually happens at COPs has a massive ripple effect. And of course, the global stocktake sort of acknowledging or even putting down some of what we know. Of course, there are IPCC reports that tell us this, but it's something that countries agree on. And that's something that you also both see where politics takes you, but at the same time where countries are going towards together. So yeah, I'm still a believer in the process. So.
It's a very interesting time for multilateralism at the moment. It's obviously quite a strange geopolitical environment, and we've obviously got a new president coming in the US at the start of next year who doesn't really believe in any of that stuff. We've got a question from an anonymous attendee about how the Trump presidency is going to impact climate action and policy globally. Daisy, do you wanna have a go at that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start just speaking a little bit of what we've seen global leaders talking about here in relation to Trump, and then Simon, you can chime in as well. So I think we have seen kind of in response to Trump's election, leaders from different major economies suggesting or like stating publicly that they see themselves stepping into more of a leadership role now that the US's role at the talks have been much diminished. So, for example, the UK told the Observer that it would see itself as somebody that could step into a leadership role. And also the EU, in its first press briefing yesterday, restated its position as one of the leading voices at COP. And I believe as well that China has a top sort of official for China has said on the sidelines of the conference that China would be willing to step into more of a leading governance role. But yeah, do you want to talk a bit about how it plays out in the negotiations, Simon?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. People talked ahead of the COP about how Trump's election win was going to overshadow things. That's not really what I've seen or heard people talking about. There's a certain kind of momentum that this kind of machine, the COP process, has of its own, and it's kind of proceeding in very much the same way as we've seen in all of the other COPs that I've been to. And in fact, there's quite a few people I've been speaking to have suggested that it's kind of created this real impetus to get an outcome. Lots of people talking up the importance of the multilateral climate process, and in order to demonstrate that, to actually back up those statements of support for multilateralism, they need to get an outcome here. So in a weird kind of way, I think it's potentially injected some sort of urgency into the talks. We're yet to see that play out, obviously, but yeah, Irina, you want to come in?
No, I just think that the timing is, of course, the one which is a difficult one, because this is the finance COP, and we are talking in terms of the US's historical responsibility and also what it has done towards its fair share on climate finance. And then now with this hanging as a shadow or a scepter is something which is a cloud around some of the climate finance talks and its own stances of what kinds of finance, how much, and yeah, I think maybe that's something that Josh can speak to. But yeah, I mean, it's timings off, and I don't know whether the vibes are off or not, but yeah.
Just adding to what Aruna said, it's quite interesting, like watching the language of US officials here. A lot of what they say is about how, well, it's fine because we've started this sort of domestic climate action train rolling in the US. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act. The transition to clean energy is inevitable, and we've helped to kickstart that. That won't stop just because Trump is the president, and that's great. But as Aruna said, this is about finance, and one thing that happened under Donald Trump's previous presidency was that that the aid budget was cut, and the US didn't give very much climate finance. I'm not actually sure how much it gave, but perhaps not at all. You'll have to check that. But the point is, the US has come here regardless, under a Biden administration, and their priority, I think it's fair to say, in the negotiations is to try and expand the list of countries that have to give money. So they are essentially saying these other countries have to start giving money now, even though we know full well that in a few months' time we might scale back our money quite significantly. And the US is a major donor. It's one of the biggest contributors of climate finance. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic for sure. But having said that, I've not actually, as Simon said, I've actually not heard people speaking about that as much as I expected to. So I don't know. Well, yeah, who knows how it's affecting things behind the scenes? But yeah.
Thanks, Josh. And Wanyo, and I can see you want to come in. I was actually going to come back to you on the sort of broader impact of Trump policies. And I know you've been listening to lots of senior Chinese officials and politicians speaking at the COP. And I just wonder if you can, maybe say a little bit about how they're talking about, China's climate efforts in the light of what's happened in the US.
Yeah, of course. So this is actually a point I want to add. So even though China and the officials didn't really name the name, but I get the feeling that they are trying to emphasize the importance of multilateralism and cooperation. So that has been reiterated by officials and some scholars that attended to some events which they launched their new reports. So the Minister of Ecology and Environment this morning, he mentioned about multilateralism twice at his speech. So in the beginning, he was talking about how important multilateral cooperation is, and even used the word, this is for the world economic recovery. And then he ended his speech again mentioning that the importance of multilateralism cooperation for climate change. So I mean, we don't really see him often at COPs, and when he appeared, he emphasized it twice. So this definitely tells you that how significant this is. And I interviewed a government affiliated think tank officials, and they were telling me this year their annual report is different. The biggest difference from this year's report compared to last year's report is they added in international cooperation as well. So for them, China alone can't to do energy transition, even if they want to, as much as they want to inside China, they can't do it unless the world is doing it as well. So they said we need to learn from each other, to learn from each other's experiences, and the cooperation is so keen at this stage. So even though they didn't mention Trump at all, but you got the vibe that they do want to see more cooperations with everyone, especially including the US.
Thanks, Wenyu. And then I should say just a little plug for the China briefing, which we publish every fortnight. We put an issue out yesterday, which is packed full of lots of insights from Wan Yuan's experience and our colleague Annika, who's back in London, about what China's been up to at the COP. And another of the things that you highlighted in that issue, Wan Yuan, was the fact that China's really talking up energy transition. This is something that they've invested a huge amount in. They're not suddenly, it's basically about their economic self-interest. They're not suddenly going to stop doing that just because a different person's been elected to the White House. We've got so many questions coming in. I'm gonna turn to Article 6. Because it's something that was, kind of touted at the start of this COP as being a kind of a day one win by the presidency. Article 6 is highly technical. It's all about carbon trading, either on an international carbon market where anyone can buy and sell credits, or bilaterally between countries. But the details are super technical. Aruna and I are both trying to get our heads around exactly what people are still arguing about. And it's worth saying that there was this deal where they got an agreement on a certain aspect of the Article 6.4, which is the international carbon market, on Monday, on the first day of the COP. And so we've got a question from Scott Vaughan saying, does that decision on Monday mean that carbon market can now start operating, or is there other guidance that has to be agreed at the COP before that can happen? So I'll have a quick stab at that, and I'll pass over to Aruna. So basically, there's a supervisory body that's sort of designated by the COP to run this international carbon market, And the chair of that body, described the Article 6 kind of situation as a box within a box. So there's like they agreed something on Monday, and that takes the market a step closer to being operational. And there are now indications that perhaps as early as next year, projects could start being registered. They could start issuing carbon credits. But I think we're not quite at the, inside the box of whatever was agreed on Monday. There's another box with, further detailed guidance that needs to be developed and further detailed rules on, the registries where information about the trading of carbon credits is stored, and all sorts of other details which are very esoteric and hard to get your head around, but also potentially have quite significant implications. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Aruna.
Mostly because also some of that information is around safeguards as well, right? And who it impacts and how that, whether those rights are intact and so on. Now, whether that and there was significant pushback from civil society and from groups who didn't quite react to the win that the presidency wanted everyone to. But essentially saying that this was not a party agreed process. Like those were recommendations which were made, which were signed off on without parties signing off on them. And that was kind of pushed through on day one. But then there is also a bit of a note in the text that emerged saying that this guidance has to be developed further, which is essentially has bought time. And that's something that we're seeing through the negotiations and how that develops.
Thanks, Aruna. Daisy, I've got a question I'd like to put to you from Sophie Marshall, which relates to COP16, which is the UN Biodiversity COP. And that took place, it finished just a week before COP29 started, and you were there for all of that in Colombia. So Sophie's asking, given that COP16 failed to reach a finance deal for nature, is that that kind of failure, if you like, at creating helpful pressure for more concrete outcomes at COP29?
Thank you. And Aruna was also there, so I'll pass over to her after. I think it's very interesting because COP16 was pretty much a week ago. I've not heard anybody mention it at all here, which is surprising to me because at the COP28 summit in Dubai, there were several high-level ministerial events on the links between climate and nature. And we also know that COP30 in Brazil is being touted as a nature COP. It's going to have nature at the heart of it. It's going to be held right by the Amazon in Belém. There is a specific biodiversity day, which is the last thematic day next week at COP. So we may see, sorry, at COP29, I'm skipping between COPs. So we may see there some more kind of like initiatives from the presidency or some new announcements. But so far, COP16 hasn't had much of a mention. So yeah, I'll pass over to Aruna if she's got anything to add.
Yeah, I'm kind of struck by and still reeling from the COP16 finale, where a decision on a new fund was bumped to whenever the COP resumes, and which was quite the last minute also push to establish the fund, and was there. I mean, the push it revived throughout and from the very start of COP16, basically being like, we've had 2 years of implementing. Has the money come forward? It hasn't. Countries haven't been able to put forward their biodiversity pledges. But the thing that strikes me the most is, of course, when talking about the amount, right? I mean, it's 20 billion by 2025, which is 3 months from now. We're talking in terms of billions, and in terms of what was also pledged, in terms of new grant money was only around the tune of 163 million. Now we're at COP29, where we're talking in trillions. So, I mean, to me, it's that massive dissonance between, nature finance and biodiversity finance and, the numbers that we're discussing here, where, of course, I mean, if we weren't able to see, it doesn't look like countries might be meeting, or they just might be able to meet that 20 billion target. How are they going to deliver on the 1.3 trillion? And that's something. Yeah, but of course, we have seen somehow in the NCQG text, in the long-term finance text, there's also, talking about debt for nature swaps, about voluntary carbon markets. There's a biodiversity finance markets that the UK is also like, in the process of putting frameworks through. So we're seeing some of those announcements at COP29, and I am, I mean, it's the relation between both, and I mean, the significant differences are still something that, are a very sharp contrast between both.
Thanks, Aruna and Daisy. Your real gluttons for punishment, and the spending all of this time, 2 weeks at COP16, and now being deeply involved in our coverage of COP29 as well. Yeah, actually, just on the COP16 point, I mean, it's quite an interesting kind of process point for the COP junkies out there. The reason that they failed, obviously it was a difficult discussion around the finance goal, but it's worth emphasizing the reason that fell apart at the last minute was not because they suddenly kind of they suddenly had a disagreement that they didn't know about before. It's the fact that they just ran out of time. People started getting their flights home, and then they no longer had quorum. There's a certain amount of people that you have to have in the room in order to take a decision, make a legal text that is officially the outcome of the COP, and they ran out of people. And so, everyone's expecting COP29 to run up, up and to and well beyond the official kind of closing point on Friday. But every hour that you go beyond that, you start running in that risk of, it's basically a big game of chicken. You run the risk of running the clock down and running out of time. Josh, obviously one of the big issues that's going to be on the plenary floor in the huddles as they're trying to close things in that closing plenary on Sunday night or whenever it is going to be this finance goal. We've got a question here from Deirdre McKenty about there's all of these different pots of money. So there's this new collective quantified goal which they're meant to be negotiating here. There's the adaptation fund, the loss and damage fund. And Deirdre's asking what's the priority of funding for all of these different finance needs, and is the money that's going into these different pots supposed to be loans or donations or what?
Okay, so yeah, it can be a bit confusing. There are a lot of different funds and avenues for providing money that have emerged from the COP process. The NCQG is well, we don't know what it is yet. I would say, first of all, it could be many different things. So perhaps we'll park that slightly. The loss and damage fund was negotiated when it was negotiated, it was an entirely new thing in that it's supposed to be providing money to deal with loss and damage, which is the sort of irreversible damages caused by climate change, things like natural disasters, just to put it very simply. That kind of money isn't covered by traditional climate finance under the UN. So it deals with mitigation, so cutting emissions, building wind turbines or whatever, and adaptation, so sort of preparing for the effects of climate change, not dealing with the aftermath. So this is actually quite a technical point in the negotiations, because one thing that the NCQG could do is open up climate finance, so loss and damage becomes part of it. But that is something which, broadly speaking, developed countries don't want to do because it implies sort of even more money. They want to keep the loss and damage fund as a separate thing. That's a thing that they've agreed to. They can contribute to it voluntarily if they feel like it, but they don't want to be obliged to provide money into it under the NCQG. Other kinds of funds, things like you mentioned the adaptation fund. There's like, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and various other things. Those things get counted into climate finance as it currently exists. So we currently have a goal, which we've not even mentioned yet, which is that developed countries are currently obliged to provide $100 billion a year. And those kind of funds, yeah, those will all count under that 100 billion, as far as I know. Yes, I hope that's answered your question. And I can definitely understand why it's sort of confusing. I mean, it's this patchwork of different funds in terms of sort of what's prioritized. Yeah, I mean, there's supposed to be a sort of a balance between funding for mitigation and adaptation. This is actually, again, a sort of big point, because basically adaptation doesn't get as much money as people would like, and actually it's kind of harder to fund adaptation because it's not as bankable. You can sort of see why building renewable energy would draw a lot of investment in, but preparing people's homes for the impact of climate change, not so much.
Thanks, Josh. Molly, I'm gonna throw one in your direction. Someone called Andrea Hirai has asked about whether we've got any stats on how many delegates and/or attendees flew to COP and how many used slow transport. I don't know if we do, but I do know that Carbon Brief published some stats on attendees to the COP just earlier this week. So you might be able to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so this COP is smaller than the last one, but actually not by as much as lots of people sort of expected, or people keep talking about how small it is in comparison with the last one, but it is actually the second largest COP that we've ever had. So there are more than 65,000 delegates who've registered to attend. So that's about 15,000 lower than last year, but still a very significant number of people. The biggest delegations that have been sent are, well, unsurprisingly, Azerbaijan has the biggest. But after that, we've got Brazil, we've got Turkey, and then there's the UAE, China, and yeah, those are kind of the big attendees that we've got going on this year. It's also got the most even gender split that we've ever had. It's still not 50-50, but it's definitely sort of going in a positive direction. In terms of the slow travel thing, we don't have figures on that, but there was news earlier this week about how many people flew in via private jet. And the number of private jets landing in Baku doubled over the last week to what it normally is, in particular over Sunday and Monday as the world leaders came. So no overall figures, but definitely an increase in private jets coming into Baku. So maybe that gives a bit of an indication as to exactly how people are traveling.
Yeah, it's worth adding just a couple of points. One is that the numbers registered does include people that aren't actually attending in person. So quite a lot of people that will be speaking at side events on panels and so on. They may be just joining, via Zoom, as we are speaking now. And those are included in the total figures. And then the other thing I think that's worth saying is we have looked at this in previous years, and people have sort of worked out the carbon footprint of all of the flights that people taking their planes to get to the COP, and it's I mean in isolation it looks like quite a big number, but in terms of global emissions it's kind of pipsqueak. And if to the extent that COP has ever sort of helped bend the curve in global emissions, which I think is probably fair to say that it has, then that easily, many times over outweighs the emissions impact of people flying here. Now let's see. Let's see, there was another question about, oh yeah, so people have noticed that the president of Argentina has ordered his delegation to pull out of the talks. I actually heard earlier that they actually haven't gone home. They're still in Baku. I guess I sort of imagine maybe they're sitting in their hotel rooms, kind of keeping up with what's going on here. But yeah, I don't know if Josh, do you want to say anything about this? What do you think? Is this like a sign of like growing sentiment against the process? What's behind their decision?
I'm not sure if I have the only insights I was speaking earlier to the journalist who broke the story. She seemed to think that despite reporting that Argentina was on the cusp of leaving the Paris Agreement under their sort of extremist neoliberal leader, Milei, she seemed to think that wouldn't happen because essentially there's too much political pressure from places like the EU and China. There's too much sort of investment in Argentina on the line, so he wouldn't risk that. But that's the only insight I really have. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak on it.
Rooney, you look like you were, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think that there has been no official confirmation, right? There's no process to initiate to say that, okay, well, we are pulling out of the Paris Agreement. So far, it mostly is this as a call, and I don't know whether it is an attempt to out Trump. But so far, neither country has, gone ahead and done anything official. So far it's not official on text, but yeah, they've just received those sort of orders. So yeah, remains to be seen.
Thanks, Runa. I mean, it's worth saying again, like Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement during his first term as president. But no, there weren't any other countries that followed him out the door, if you like. So, we're in a different world now, I guess. But I think that's questionable, the idea that lots of people will follow him out the door this time around. I'm going to take a question myself. There's a question from Christine KO about whether countries, having agreed the outcome, the global stocktake outcome at COP28 last year, can they now reject or modify that as a starting point? And would that mean that they have to start from scratch every single time at the COP? So, I mean, I guess it's there's two different ways into this. One is that, the negotiating teams at the COP, they absolutely love referring back to things that have been written and agreed before. So they're real junkies for kind of referring to paragraph 97 of the stock take, of 1/CMA.3 or whatever it is. And that you see references throughout the kind of the outcome text of each COP referring back to multiple different documents in that way. So precedent's clearly like an important part of the regime, and I think that's true of any legal regime. So in that sense, it is written down. It's that legal agreement, continues to stand. But I suppose, on the other hand, they could, they even if they just decided not to say anything at all about, this is the issue for countries that want to see that carried forward. If this COP would say absolutely nothing at all about what was agreed at COP28, if they didn't mention fossil fuels, if the words fossil fuels once again disappeared from the COP outcome, then I think, regardless of whether they explicitly undid that agreement last year, that would still be seen as a step backwards for the process. So hopefully that answers things a little bit. Daisy, I'm going to turn to you for the next question. There's one from Justin Walker asking, how is it that two petrostates got selected to host the COPs in a row?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. So the way that COP presidencies work is that they rotate through different world regions. So when Dubai was chosen to host COP28, it was the turn of Asia Pacific to host the COP. And Dubai was put forward a bid and was selected by parties. For Azerbaijan, this is the Eastern Europe region. There was quite an interesting dynamic in terms of selecting the host for this COP, where Russia said that it would veto any country in the European Union, and it ended up being that the kind of two viable options would be Azerbaijan or Armenia, and Azerbaijan was chosen. And just as an extra point, Armenia has been chosen to host the next biodiversity summit, so we'll potentially see some of you in Armenia in 2 years' time.
Josh, we've got another, well, there's lots of finance questions, but I'm going to ask one more from Savio Cavallo. Can we expect any progress on the global solidarity levies or innovative new sources of climate finance?
So it's definitely something that people speak about. There'll be sort of events about it. Civil society will talk about it. It's not the kind of thing that would. I think it's unlikely to see a lot of progress within the sort of the formal like NCQG discussions. I don't really have any insights into whether there'll be any sort of developments outside the negotiations, I'm afraid. It's definitely something like when. So I think, as we know, so currently climate finance, a lot of it comes from essentially the aid budgets of countries like the UK, US, EU. And I think those of us who live in those countries know that it's not very politically feasible that our governments are going to massively ramp up aid spending. So I think, it's definitely interesting and to see people talking about innovative forms of generating public finance, because undoubtedly, you know, if this COP did come to a decision to raise, you know, to contribute, where countries had to contribute a lot more public finance, then, you know, perhaps those sort of things would need to feed into it. But yeah, I don't really have any like massive insights beyond that. It's, as I say, it's definitely something that civil society talk about. But yeah, that's all. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts.
Well, I think we've only got about 5 minutes left, so maybe we can move on to the next question. We try and get in one or maybe two more questions. I'm going to turn to Wan Yuan and Aruna. We've got a question about the BRICS, so that's the group of countries, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. There's been a lot of attention on the BRICS countries in, you know, sort of global politics in general. Are there any aspects of the kind of negotiation behaviour that coming out of Baku that, you know, reflect any sort of realignment in global politics?
Well, the short answer to the question is I don't know. I know I'm not sure if this exactly answers your question, but I think China is on behalf of the basic country instead of BRICS, which is Brazil, China, India, and South Africa, and submitted a proposal ahead of COP29 to include concerns with climate change related unilateral restrictive trade measures. So what they want, basically, according to the full text, is that the unilateral trade restrictive measures adopted by developed countries parties under the guise of climate objective disproportionate adverse effectives on developing country parties to make it short that they don't like it, and they have like basically what people think is they don't like the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. So I don't really know if they can solve the whole thing at this COP. Aruna can add more information to this question.
Yeah, so it was a proposal from BASIC led by China to introduce this as part of the COP29 agenda, and that was part of one of the things around the agenda fight. This has also happened last year as well, to basically talk about, you know, CBAM is coming into force. There's also the EU deforestation regulation that countries are adopting these climate policies without looking at its ripple effects on vulnerable countries as well as emerging economies where a lot of the production is centered, right? Whether that's, you know, industrial or agricultural. And over and above, you know, saying that, okay, well, finance is difficult to come up with. So it is over and above. So it's one of those issues which, of course, in the agenda fight, it was kind of dropped from the agenda, but also included under consultations in which there are consultations that are taking place on these measures. And that was what we saw on the very first day. But those are concerns that, you know, have been coming up, and also it has been brought up again by the African group of countries as well that have echoed, saying that, you know, these measures are having impacts on vulnerable nations, right? It's you're expected to cut emissions, and these are also policies being developed. So it's also, you know, taking into consideration the US and the IRA, where you are thinking of yourself or countries are thinking or implementing measures which have huge impacts across the world. And in terms of what are the other forums, there's the World Trade Organization, and then there's the UNFCCC. So why isn't this being discussed as well in terms of in a forum like a COP?
Thanks, Aruna. Carry on, Wan Yuan.
I'm just going to add one point very quickly. So I think it's African report this morning that they said African countries will not support the base of countries' back contribution to NCQG, including new polluters such as China. So that gives you some different, you know, maybe it's not as, you know, the solidarity is not as strong as we thought on some issues.
Thank you. We've got another quick question I'm going to try and answer super quickly about Article 6. Why are there so many people, groups, and NGOs still so opposed to carbon credits, even after it's written into the Paris Agreement and so much time has been spent to reach a deal on the framework under Article 6? And is that ultimately going to sort of undermine this process going anywhere? So, I mean, you know, basically, there's quite good reasons why a lot of people are opposed to carbon markets. You know, we did a big sort of special report on this last year, and, you know, there's a pretty terrible record in the carbon market in terms of, not genuinely achieving emissions reductions, having issues in terms of human rights, and so on. And so, people are, rightly a little bit skeptical. I think, the people involved in the Article 6.4 mechanism are saying, like, this is the first time that this has been done in a way that's aligned with the Paris Agreement, with safeguards for human rights and environmental integrity and so on, and sustainable development. I guess, the proof will be in the pudding. We'll have to wait and see. And with that, I think we are at the top of the hour. And so I'm just going to wrap things up and thank you all so much. We've had hundreds and hundreds of people joining the call, and I really hope that you found this useful. If you do, please give us some feedback and let us know what you think. We'll think about doing this again next year. And thanks very much to all of my colleagues for joining me. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the COP, everyone. Bye bye.